Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first Making Public History seminar for 2026 on the topic Women and the Criminal Justice System in Australia. I'm Margaret Anderson from the Old Treasury Building, and I'm your host for this evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I thank them for their care of country and of culture and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd like to extend that respect to any other elders who might be joining us tonight. Making Public Histories is a seminar series offered jointly by the Monash University History Program, the History Council of Victoria, and the Old Treasury Building. Each event aims to explore issues and approaches in making public histories. The seminars are open to anyone interested in the creation and impact of history in contemporary society, and I'm delighted that so many have joined us this evening. This seminar is also offered as a contribution to the Women's History Month program in Victoria. Now, we have a terrific opening seminar this evening exploring the history of women in the criminal justice system, a topic, of course, of continuing resonance in the present. Our first speaker is Lucy Sussex. Lucy is an honorary fellow at La Trobe University. Her award-winning fiction includes novels and 5 short story collections. She has examined crime fiction's origins in the books Women Writers and Detectives in the 19th Century, Blockbuster, and her latest book with Megan Brown, Outrageous Fortunes, published in 2025, about Mary and George Fortune. Her presentation tonight is based on that book, and it is entitled The Outrageous Fortunes, The Hidden History of a Crime-Writing Mother and Her Criminal Son. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you. I want to start by saying that Mary Fortune, in terms of the law, when she was born in 1832, into inequality. She described herself as a sentient being of the weaker sex, with a degree of sarcasm, because there was nothing weak about her. But she had inequality of education, she had legal inequality with no professional access to the justice system, no female police nor lawyers, jurors and judges. And upon marriage, she became which she did twice, both briefly, she became even more unequal because she was subject to the common law of femme covert, in which a woman was, as a wife, was subsumed legally into her husband, and he controlled her property and also her earnings, which Charlotte Bronte was considerably surprised to discover this happened. Mary Fortune also, in terms of children, she could not control her fertility, nor could she control what happened to her children. So that when she came to Australia in 1855, the evidence is that she was running away from her husband and taking their 3-year-old son with her because she would have lost custody immediately. And it would have reverted to the father. Now, this legal situation did change over the century. 1870, the Married Women's Property Act, and Mary Fortune indeed lived long enough to be on the electoral roll and to vote. Now, I want to consider her and the justice system firstly as daughter, as wife, as mother, as professional, and we can also say as offender herself, including being wanted by the police. And she's born in 1832 in Belfast, Ireland. Her father's a civil engineer, but interested in poetry. He writes poetry to her. She has a degree of education that actually puts her, in terms of writing, towards the male scale of writing. And she's got a degree of self-confidence. He's a surveyor and engineer. He goes all over Ireland. They emigrate to Canada during the famine. He works on the railways, and she meets a young railway surveyor called Joseph Fortune, her maiden name being Mary Wilson, which has made her early life really hard to trace. And she marries Joseph Fortune. They have a baby son. Her father, George Wilson, decides that he'll go to the Australian goldfields in the early 1850s, and she follows. We don't actually have any knowledge of what Mary Fortune looks like. There's no photos. We do have a description later on. So I commissioned an artist's impression by Freddie Bear, but this was used on the cover of Outrageous Fortunes. And the second image is what we wanted to use as a cover. It's a damaged photograph by Walter Lind, because she was a woman who was erased partly by her own choice and partly by history, with the emphasis on his. And I should also mention that her achievements, that she writes the first Australian book of crime stories and the first by woman worldwide. Only 2 copies of this book are known to survive. And she wrote over 500 detective stories in the longest running early detective series in the persona, convincingly, of a male detective. So she gets to Castlemaine on the goldfields, and here she is in her father's become a storekeeper at Terwilter near Castlemaine, and Terwilter is described as being a place where sticking up and horse stealing are rather common. She's not there a month before there's a murder. A woman is murdered, and she writes about this in an unreliable memoir. But she becomes more intimately acquainted with crime due to her father's profession, because he's running a goldfields store. And the best way to make money was to sell illicit alcohol to the miners who had a great thirst. And she doesn't, in her memoir, she doesn't actually say that's what they're doing, but in her stories, which were mostly published under a pseudonym and male, she could be more frank. And she said, in 1899, she wrote, on the Terwilter goldfield, there were few women, but they were all involved in selling alcohol. This actually puts her at some risk, and because the police frequently raided such establishments, and so when father and daughter are at the Taradale goldfields in early 1856, there is a raid which she describes herself having witnessed. One of the things, she knows a lot of things that she should, as a conventional Victorian lady, not know about, and one is about the mechanism by which these goldfields raids were done, in that the police used informers who had a sly grog and then would stand up in court and say, I had a nobbler at Mr. Wilson's. This raid might, in fact, have involved one or both of them being arrested, because she's very annoyed about it. And she does describe Castlemaine Lockup, which was a log cabin, from the inside, and I can't explain it otherwise, but the records are faulty, we can't be sure. But another thing she knows a lot about is about distilling illicit spirits. She knows exactly how to do it. And this, of course, was another means of making money. One consequence of the raid was that she became pregnant around this time to give birth to a son in the Ballarat area. 9 months later, saying the father was Joseph Fortune was geographically impossible, because he was back in Canada. And if it's known that her child is illegitimate, then this compromises her socially and as a fallen woman. And this is a pretty crucial thing to avoid. Nonetheless, in 1858, in Kingower Goldfield, she marries Percy Brett. And you will see at the centre of this image a mounted trooper looking very dapper on his horse and in his smart uniform. She comments how smart their uniforms were. So she marries Percy Brett, who's a mounted trooper, and thereby committing bigamy, which was very common at the time, because divorce was hard and people simply nicked off to another goldfield, grew a beard, changed their names. Daisy Bates committed bigamy twice, and Mary Fortune, as we know, only once. But the marriage didn't last long, it broke up, but from it she got the means. She knew enough about the police to write convincingly in a police persona as a detective. I also think that it's likely that Brett was not her only liaison with the police, because she seems to know a good deal about it. And when, in 1865, the Australian Journal publishes a police story called The Shepherd's Hut, she immediately thinks it's not very good and sends in her own story under a male pseudonym and is accepted. And this leads to a professional gig which lasts for about 45 years on and off, and which she's writing the whole time crime stories, which is she's among the first two women to write police procedurals. As a result of having a permanent job with the Australian Journal, she moves to Melbourne, a very rough town, and but a very rich area. Nothing but murders and bloodshed and hanging is how a character of hers described her own stories. Well, there's other things as well. We'd use it as the title of our book of Mary Fortune's crime stories. And this illustration shows a rather nonplussed woman looking at two men in a graveyard digging up a plant, and what that was stolen goods which were hidden in a graveyard. This comes from a wonderful magazine called The Police News, which was run by Fortune's editor, Richard Egan Lee. And Egan Lee was a mixture of radical politics and true crime, profusely illustrated. Egan Lee and Mary Fortune were both fascinated by women and the law and how it treated them. So here is a woman who is cutting an unfaithful lover's throat from the back while he's playing the piano. This actually happened. And here on the other image is an elopement in Sydney in which the bride's parents are shown beating up the prospective groom beside the railway station. Again, rich material, which she uses fully. The thing is that with her job, because she's female, she's being paid less. It was commented that she probably wrote more and got paid less than any other writer of the time in Australia, which meant she let lodgings and she was a governess, and it was stressful. And this was a woman with traumas. Her eldest son had died horribly. She knew about a few things in her stories which were unmentionable if she'd been writing in a persona. One is that she writes about sex crimes. Her second story was about a serial sex murderer. And she's the only Victorian woman I know to have written about gang rape. She does this twice in a very similar setting. I just hope that she wasn't writing from experience. But because she was writing as in a male persona, she could do this and not be considered indelicate. But she had a few problems, and one of them was that she was given to drink, and for which she, being found drunk and disorderly in the street, she got 7 days jail. I think this was in old Melbourne jail because one of her detectives describes the prison uniform there as a coarse red-striped petticoat, cotton-checked jacket made and shaped anyhow, as if a male would notice that a woman's prison uniform wasn't very well made or becoming. She also comes to police attention for other reasons. From the age of 14, her surviving son, George, is a juvenile offender, and he's an early larrikin active in Collingwood. She knew disreputable types on the goldfields, including a serial killer who was very active in New Zealand. But an even more intimate acquaintance was, she knows a lot about informers. The term was fizgigs. And police, because they didn't have forensics, had collections of informers. And and again, this is something she knows too much about, male and female informers. She depicts the recruiting of a female informer, which begins with flirtation, then the woman has a grudge, then there is some question of monetary compensation, and it goes from there. And a retired policeman said, this is very much like how you would recruit an informer, and that she fits the profile for being alcoholic, short of money, and having a child in the police system. So it's very credible that she was a police informer. She knew police, she knew Thomas O'Callaghan, later Chief Commissioner. Her stories were getting information from newspapers, but also from the police, but also, on the other way, from the criminal milieu from which her son was involved. She actually writes about things her son did. How we know? We do know that she was wanted by the police once in 1874 for being a hostile witness in a case of rape, and she scarpered. But they described her because they were looking for her, and so that we know that she was tall, thin, pale-faced, and habitually wore black, a true Melburnian, and elastic-sided boots. Also, she was living in Easy Street, which is infamous for various other reasons. She was very well informed with the criminal justice system, and not the least is as regards her son, because he was a recidivist criminal, and this went on for most of his life. And the worst thing George Fortune ever did, he was mainly a thief, tended not to be violent, got into bad company. And the Simpsons Road bank robbery, probably the most famous bank robbery in Melbourne. A gang of 5 masked men held up and took a lot of money, and these were very heavy criminals who were one murdered policeman, another one was hanged, and George, once he became famous because of this robbery, and it hung around his neck like a millstone, even when he went to Tasmania to try and make a fresh start. He couldn't get out of trouble, and the police knew where he was. And as a result, he died effectively in jail 2 years before his mother did. Now, it took years to find her grave because she changed the spelling of her name, Fortune with 2 F's. Eventually we found it, Springvale Cemetery, unmarked grave, but there was a move on hand to get a proper memorial and even a headstone. It's being considered. But her true legacy is her books, is her writing, over 500 crime stories and memoirs and journalism and so much else, and the record of an extraordinary person.
Lucy, thank you so much. What an eventful life, putting it mildly. It's extraordinary. Tell me, can you comment? That's an amazing number of stories that she published, and the initial book. What do we know about the influence that she had on fiction writing and or crime fiction writing at the time?
Well, Fergus Hume would have been familiar with her work when he wrote the 1885 Mystery of a Hansom Cab, and he probably knew who she was. Her stories were reprinted in the Australian Journal after her death until the 1930s, and that means the Australian Journal went all over Australia. It was very widely distributed, so it's very likely that Arthur Upfield read her work and noticed the benefits of a distinctive detective and the Australian setting, because she's a very, very good observer of Australian scenes. So, but she was also pirated internationally, and so her work appeared in Ireland and in America, in England, and in America she actually appeared in the American equivalent of the Woman's Week, 19th century equivalent of the Woman's Weekly. So huge readership. So
Guaranteed fame.
yeah, exactly. But she got no money from it.
Uh, well, Lucy, thank you. And we'll come back because there are some fascinating threads in there, not least the fact that she's writing about sex crimes at a time when mostly that was considered to be, quote, not suitable to be published. So exploring some of that would be terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer Anderson. Jennifer is a managing lawyer at Women's Legal Service Victoria. Her doctoral thesis examined the creation of the children's court jurisdiction in Victoria in the early 20th century. But her wider research explores the experiences of both women and children in the early Victorian criminal justice and social welfare systems. Her presentation tonight is entitled Women on the Margins, Navigating the Court System in Early 20th Century Melbourne. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here tonight. This is a story of a rather different type of lady, although intriguingly, there are some interesting similarities. So I'm telling you tonight the story of a woman called Sarah Conquest. She was a working class woman. She lived in inner Melbourne at the turn of the 20th century. She attracted considerable press attention for a series of court hearings in 1904, which is what I'm going to focus on tonight. But in fact, she and her 2 sons also appeared before the Melbourne courts in quite a variety of ways from 1902 right into the 1920s. So Sarah's story illustrates both the ways in which working class women and their children were subject to legal intervention, but also, interestingly enough, how such women tried, with and without success, as we'll see, to use the legal system for their financial and reputational benefit. And this PowerPoint is a very nice figure of Lady Justice just outside the Melbourne Supreme Court. If some of you are from Melbourne, you may recognise it. And as we shall see, Sarah did in turn have a little appearance at the Supreme Court in 1904. So let's move on. So I'm going to start tonight with a story, in fact, about Sarah's elder son, Albert. On the 6th of April 1904, Albert Conquest, who was then aged 8, appeared before the Melbourne City Police Court charged with the theft of a toy bugle. And the story went that at 11 p.m. the previous evening, Albert had taken the toy from a market stall. He was immediately apprehended, arrested, and then spent the night in the police cells. Albert said he was trying to get money for his mother. And the case attracted attention for 3 reasons. One was Albert's very young age. The other was the triviality of the charge. And then there was the night he'd spent in the watch house in the company of adult offenders. And the Melbourne Age, which we've quoted here, noted that the sight of the forlorn little figure huddled in a couple of blankets on the bare floor of the cell was a pitiable spectacle. However, as the police prosecutor, Inspector Gray, noted, this was not Albert's first appearance before the police courts. At some time over the previous 2 years, Albert had been charged with being a neglected child, and he'd been made a ward of the state, although, as was not uncommon, as we'll see, he was in fact still living with his mother, who was paid for his upkeep. For this reason, the police elected not to pursue the charge against Albert further. Instead, they suggested notifying the Department for Neglected Children, who might then remove Albert from his mother's care. And at this point, the court's attention switched rather rapidly from Albert to his mother, Mrs. Sarah Conquest. As Inspector Gray noted pointedly, she had also recently been before the court. She was called in and she was asked to explain herself, and she gave her story. Sarah told the court that she was a married woman living in Kelvin Place in South Carlton, which was a very impoverished area. Her husband was a baker in Western Australia. He'd recently sent her a letter with some money, and he'd promised more to move the family over there. She conceded that Albert was indeed boarded out to her by the Department for Neglected Children. And at this point, the magistrate, Mr. Panton, abruptly terminated the proceedings and, quote, told her to take the boy away with her and report to the department what her husband intended to do. And if her husband did not do as he said, a warrant must be issued to bring him back and compel him to do his duty. And Sarah and Albert were then allowed to leave court together. So this case of Albert Conquest attracted an enormous amount of publicity. It reactivated interest in the experience of children before the police courts, and it was one of the key triggers for the establishment of children's courts in Victoria shortly afterwards in 1906. But equally interesting here is the background to Albert's appearance and the situation of his mother, Sarah. So Sarah's story, as told to the court, was sad but fairly common. A story of respectable poverty, of intermittent support from a husband working interstate at a time of high unemployment, and then of departmental intervention. But was it true? In fact, as we shall see, Sarah's story was certainly a story of surviving on the margins, but it was rather different in parts from the public version she was presenting here. So let's look at Sarah. Who is she? She was born Sarah Archibald in the city of Melbourne in 1872. She was the youngest of at least 4 siblings. On the 19th of April 1895, Sarah gave birth to Albert George Conquest, who was named after his father, Albert Sr. On Albert's birth certificate, Sarah was described as a dressmaker and Albert Sr. a baker. The parents stated that they'd married a year previously, on the 19th of April 1894. In fact, they weren't married, but they did do so 6 weeks later, on the 5th of June. And in 1901, Sarah and Albert had a second son, the very unfortunately named Norman Conquest. Albert Sr. had a considerable criminal history, albeit of a rather minor variety. And we now turn to Albert Sr. The Melbourne suburban press was sprinkled with his name throughout the 1890s and the early years of the 20th century, with charges like using offensive language and being drunk and disorderly. In October 1894, by which time Sarah was pregnant with Albert Jr., the Paran Telegraph, as you see on the PowerPoint, described him as a budding blackguard for being rowdy in the streets in the early hours of Sunday morning and using, quote, foul and filthy language. So, perhaps not surprisingly, the relationship between Sarah and Albert Sr. did not long last Norman's birth. In February 1902, Sarah attended the North Melbourne Police Court to lay a charge of desertion against her husband. The aim was apparently financial, that is, she wanted to seek a court order for maintenance for herself and the two children. Shortly afterwards, Albert was picked up by police for being drunk in charge of a horse, and he was remanded to answer this charge, and the case was then heard on the 3rd of March 1902. And here's the North Melbourne Courier. Sarah gave evidence at the hearing that Albert had left in December 1901, quote, without warning, and he did not leave a penny in the house. Albert was apparently now working as a carpet layer rather than a baker, although, as Sarah noted acidly, he was a loafer and only liked to work for beer. Sarah sought 15 shillings a week in maintenance. In response, Albert, quote, made a rambling statement denying his wife's allegations, but the court paid very little attention to him and made a maintenance order for 12 shillings and sixpence per week. This was not really enough to support a woman with two children, but as we shall see, in any event, no maintenance was in fact ever paid. And so sometime over the next 2 years, Sarah took the more drastic step of seeking financial assistance from the state. At the turn of the 20th century, as perhaps some of you will know, Victoria actually had no coordinated state welfare system. Relief was largely delivered by women's benevolent societies, often state-funded, but administered privately as charities. And Sarah may well have sought charitable assistance, but for ongoing support, her really only option was to have a child charged with neglect, which via a legal fiction was increasingly interpreted to include being without means of support. A court hearing followed, at which the child was formally committed to the care of the Department for Neglected Children, and that department then made a decision about where the child should be placed. But increasingly, children were in fact what we call boarded out with their mothers rather than being removed. It was cheaper than institutionalisation or trying to find a foster placement. So between 1900 and 1910, the period we're talking about a quarter to a half of new state wards were in fact returned home like little Albert. But this type of application very much favoured the respectable poor, or women who could demonstrate that their poverty was due to some external cause and who were otherwise able to care well for their children. Even with this, the rate of financial support was still very minimal. We know that Sarah was being paid 5 shillings a week for Albert and possibly the same for Norman, but she would have needed other help or to undertake other employment to survive. And as many of you will also know, Sarah's employment options would have been very limited. Dressmakers, the stated profession on her marriage certificate, were numerous and they were very poorly paid. If they worked in factories, the hours were long and there was no provision for childcare. So many women in Sarah's position were forced to take outwork to complete in their own homes, generally for a pittance. These women often lived in extreme poverty and could turn to other, less respectable options. And this brings us to Sarah's next court appearance. So in March 1904, Sarah had appeared already before the City Court, and indeed the same prosecutor and the same magistrate, on a charge of soliciting prostitution and using insulting words. The evidence against her, according to Constable Bryan, the chief witness, was that at about 11 p.m. on the 4th of March 1904, while on duty in Flinders Street, he had seen Sarah accosting men in the street. He warned her to move on, but she didn't appear to take any notice of him, and a short while later he came across her in a right-of-way with a man. Constable Bryan asked her to explain herself, at which point she used insulting words to him, and he then arrested her. Constable Bryan gave further evidence that he'd, quote, often seen the accused in the company of reputed prostitutes, one of which was her sister Charlotte. In the face of this apparently strong evidence, however, Sarah managed to turn the tables. And interestingly enough, she had legal representation from a Mr. Kane, who was a criminal defence lawyer. And this was very unusual. And the reason is that the state of Victoria didn't provide free legal representation at this time for anything but extremely serious charges. And it's very unclear how Sarah could have afforded to pay. But obviously she did, and it was a very good tactic. Mr. Kane's case was that his client was, quote, a respectable married woman whose character had been grossly impugned. Sarah's sister Charlotte may have been not a very good character, but he stated that Sarah herself had an impeccable reputation. Sarah then gave evidence that she was a married woman with 8 children, 2 living, and her husband was a baker in Western Australia who sent her £3 a month. She claimed that she supplemented this income by work she did for, quote, various respectable ladies. And her story was that on the night of the 4th of March, she'd been collecting money, selling tickets for a charitable performance. The constable, she claimed, had made a mistake and arrested her when she threatened to complain about him. It seems a rather unlikely story, but Sarah must have been persuasive. She was followed in court by her landlord, Mr. Edward MacDonald, a retired civil servant, and he gave evidence that Sarah was a respectable and particularly clean woman and kept her place and her children creditably, and this was no doubt also important. The state of a woman's home and the presentation of her children were often cited as evidence of respectability. Mr. Panton, the magistrate, agreed, noting that we're of the opinion that there has been some terrible mistake. This is not the slightest trace of evidence against her, and Sarah was acquitted. But was it a terrible mistake? Women on the margins did often turn to casual prostitution, but for Sarah, the stakes were high. There was not just her reputation at stake, but also the placement of her children, who could have been removed from her care at any hint of disreputable behaviour. And this presumably explains what happened next. In the days immediately following this court appearance, instead of retreating in relief, Sarah went on to make a formal complaint against Constable Brian, the arresting officer, for wrongful arrest. She swore statements confirming that everything she'd said at the hearing was true, with one exception. She admitted she hadn't actually been receiving £3 a month from her husband, Albert. This followed a visit from a Miss Emma Bryant of the Neglected Children's Department, who had accused her of deceiving that department about her financial situation. Sarah backtracked rapidly and told Miss Bryant, and later the police, that she hadn't actually received any money, but had made the statement on the advice of her solicitor. This was a fatal admission. On the 13th of April 1904, police issued a warrant for Sarah's arrest on a charge of perjury. So perjury was an indictable offence, which meant that there were 2 separate court hearings. There was initial committal hearing at the police courts of the lower court, followed by a Supreme Court trial if she was committed for trial. So on the 22nd of April 1904, Sarah again appeared at the City Court before Mr. Panton and 4 other magistrates. Mr. Kane again defended her, but in the meantime, the police had done a very rapid investigation and they turned up with 6 additional witnesses. One of these was Mr. Edward Shea, assistant clerk at the North Melbourne Police Court, who gave evidence that Sarah had never received any money from Albert under her maintenance order, and he knew this because, quote, she, Sarah, had been many times up to see me to ascertain whether any money had been sent under the order, and there was none. He was followed by no fewer than 5 women who all claimed that Sarah had indeed been in Flinders Street accosting men on the night in question. And this was enough for Mr. Panton, who, in a rapid about-face, declared that the case was a glaring case of perjury, and Sarah was then committed for trial. So, not even a month later, on the 17th of May, Sarah appeared before Mr. Justice Hood, and of course an all-male jury at this time, at the Melbourne Supreme Court. This time, she was defended by a Mr. Sonnenberg, and the case for the Crown began very well. Constable Brian repeated his version of events about the 4th of March, followed by the 5 witnesses, but things then rapidly unravelled. As Mr. Sonnenberg began to address the jury, one of the female witnesses, who according to the Argus reporter had been behaving very riotously all day, interrupted him with a loud, "That is a lie." An outraged Justice Hood demanded that she be removed from the court and locked up for contempt of court. Sarah then started to give evidence, only to be herself interrupted by 2 other women, both of whom were also promptly locked up for contempt of court. And Justice Hood was clearly unimpressed. In summing up, he clearly favoured Sarah, stating that the 3 witnesses who'd left court were undoubtedly loose characters, and the other 2 were doubtful. The jury deliberated for several hours, but ultimately found Sarah not guilty, And for the second time, as we see from the PowerPoint, she walked out of court a free woman. Now, Sarah could still perhaps have melted away into obscurity at this point, but she was clearly out for revenge. And so, along with her sister Charlotte and an unnamed man, the next day, Sarah waited outside the Melbourne jail for the release of Edith Reed, one of the women who'd given evidence against her. When Edith appeared, the trio set upon her, calling her foul names and assaulting her so violently that the jail wardens were forced to intervene. And so, on the 26th of May, 1904, Sarah appeared yet again before the Melbourne Police Court. This time, she was charged with assault, and her good fortune ran out. She was convicted and fined, ironically, the sum of £3 and costs, and in default, 1 month's imprisonment. At which point, Sarah did finally exit the public stage, at least for the time being. So just to sum up here, I think the story of Sarah Conquest reveals very nicely both the complexity and the pitfalls faced by women in the court system in Victoria in the early 20th century. Although, as we've seen, some meagre assistance was available to deserted wives with children, this support also depended on their ability to convince the court that they were in need, but also respectable. And sometimes, as in Sarah's case, these two factors could conflict. Respectability was also very important in accessing charity, and that probably explains why Sarah was so determined to go to such lengths to defend her reputation. We're left with the impression of a determined and a very feisty woman who was prepared to use the court system and to challenge the authority of the police in her attempts to survive in a pretty hostile world. And by and large, she succeeded, in that she does seem to have retained care of her children and the meagre state support that went with it. And finally, in 1914, she found another man to support her in a bigamist marriage to a William Rotheroe, who hopefully proved to be a better husband than Albert Conquest. And just to finish with a final word about Sarah's sons. So young Albert, the 8-year-old we began with, despite his early contact with the criminal justice system, seems to have largely stayed out of trouble. Norman, the toddler, on the other hand, was constantly in and out of the courts. By the age of 12, Norman had been incarcerated in the John Murray, a training ship for delinquent boys, from which he frequently absconded, and on at least one occasion to his mother's house. By his teens, Norman was in trouble for pickpocketing, assault, and robbery, at which point Sarah emerges into the historical record again, attending court in support, or perhaps in resignation, for her son. Norman was in and out of custody on minor sentences throughout the 1920s, and he ended the decade serving 18 months for bigamy, in a rather ironic echo of his mother's pattern some 16 years before. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. My goodness, we have some bigamists tonight amongst
Yes.
other activities.
Yes.
That was just a fascinating story, a sad one, but very, very interesting. Tell me a quick question. I think I heard you say that Sarah managed to persuade the courts to support her children through a legal fiction. What did you mean by that?
Sure. I guess it's a slight side issue here, but effectively the situation in Victoria at the turn of the 20th century was, as I said, there was no formal state support for women and children in this situation. What there was a piece of legislation called the Neglected Children's Act, which is basically Victoria's later stage interpretation of the English Industrial Schools Acts. And what those acts were intended to do was effectively allow for the incarceration of, quote, neglected children. So effectively children who were found wandering the streets or, who were behaving in a riotous manner or something like that. It wasn't prison, but it was not far off. But by the time we're talking about, interestingly, what had happened is a rather sort of morph of this legislation, and it was increasingly used by women like Sarah who needed state financial assistance but actually wanted their children placed with them. And increasingly the way the courts interpreted this legislation was just like this. So there were growing numbers of children who were not wandering the streets, who were not behaving riotously, but were very impoverished, with respectable mothers like Sarah, or perhaps not, but we shall see, who were allowed to stay at home, and then a very small amount of financial assistance was paid for them. It was fairly tenuous, as we've seen, that the state was still their guardian and they could be removed at any time, but often they were allowed to stay at home. And that situation only changed actually in 1919, where there was amending legislation to remove that class of child effectively from the Neglected Children's Act.
And so at that point, the social welfare system kicks in. Is that what happens then, or?
To some extent, it was still very limited, but what that piece of legislation did was effectively say that these children were not necessarily wards of the state, but they could be supported by the state in some very, very limited circumstances. The full social welfare, as you know, did not come really until a great deal later. It was very limited.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's just a fascinating story, and as I said, there are some parallels there, not only in the bigamy, but in all sorts of other ways. So thank you very much for that.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Our final speaker this evening is Dr. Lainey Anderson, OAM. Lainey is a writer whose 35-year career in journalism and public relations included 17 years as a columnist with Adelaide's Sunday Mail, as well as stints at the Herald Sun and London's The Times. Lainey completed a PhD with University of South Australia researching the life of Kate Cox, the inspiration behind her best-selling historical cosy crime novel, The Death of Dora Black. Her presentation tonight is entitled Kate Cox, Pioneering Policewoman Lost to History. Welcome, Lainey.
Thank you so much for having me, Margaret, and hello everybody from Ghana land here in Adelaide. It's a pleasure to be with you. Yes, so tonight I'm talking about Kate Cox, who was certainly no bigamist, Margaret. At the age of 40, unmarried and strictly Methodist, she became South Australia's first policewoman. And in so doing became the first policewoman in the British Empire employed on the same salary as men and with the same powers of arrest. Now, I say first in the British Empire, anyone from New South Wales who knows anything about women police would say that New South Wales had policewomen first, and they did, but their rates of pay and conditions were not equal to the men. So that's how South Australia claims the first in the British Empire, employed on the same salary and with the same powers of arrest. So I learnt about Kate Cox in 2020, and when I realised that her full name was Fanny Kate Boadicea or Boudica Cox, I thought, there's a woman I can't ignore. So I ended up doing a PhD on her, exploring her sort of life in its entirety, to try and get to understand the archive as much as possible before being inspired by her life to write a work of fiction, a popular murder mystery that might get her name, and also the women of World War I Adelaide, who have been largely sort of written out of history as well, to get all of them back into a popular work of fiction that might raise a bit of knowledge about history that's largely, being written by men about men. So who was Kate Cox? Well, she was born in 1875 in South Australia's Copper Triangle in Moonta. Her father was a miner. Her mother was a teacher. Anthony Cox had been sent down the mines at the age of 7 back in Cornwall, had never learnt to read and write, and it was Kate's mother, Elizabeth George, who taught him to read and write with history books, hence Kate getting Boadicea and her brother being named Arthur Wellesley after the Duke of Wellington. So we have Kate Cox being brought up in the very early years in mining town, and then at the age of 7, the family moved to Quorn, which in South Australia was above the Goyder line, which was the point at which farming really was impossible. Sadly for the family and many others, there had been significant rain in sort of the 5 years before the early 1880s, and South Australian government started selling off huge tracts of land above this designated Goyder's line, including, you can see there, the township of Quorn, which is basically right on the edge of the South Australian desert. And after they bought the land, they had 5 years of drought, followed by a locust plague, followed by severe storms which ruined the crop. The family was stony broke, massively in debt. Dad went back to the mines and Elizabeth went back to teaching, working in a tiny one-teacher school and trying to raise her 3 children and living alone with the kids. So Kate endured a childhood of poverty and family separation. There's 10 years of the archive where it's absolutely silent on her life in the 1890s. All we know is that she was sent to relatives in Victoria to finish her schooling and do chores. And she emerges back into the archive in around 1900, the turn of the century, as an assistant teacher at a country school in South Australia. And then she's employed at the Edwardstown Industrial School for neglected children, where she works, and said later that that sort of was her calling, to look after the neglected children of South Australia. So that takes us to the new century and heading towards World War One. So in 1915, amid a global moral panic, it's been described by women who have explored women's policing branches around the world. There was a sort of a global moral panic about the dearth of men in major cities around the world, and this rising freedom of young women who were given roles that had traditionally been given to men and suddenly had more money and more independence and were becoming sexually exploitative. So like many governments around the world, the South Australian government started getting harangued by women's groups and reform groups and church groups here in Adelaide that they wanted women police on the beat. So the state government in the middle of 1915 advertised for women to come forward who might like to be policewomen. Now, Kate Cox was not one of the 200 women in Adelaide who put up their hands to be policewomen. She said, "I am worthy of this job. You will give it to me. I will not ask for it." And why was she so sure of herself? Well, for 9 years, she had been one of the world's first juvenile probation officers here in Adelaide, and she'd been working one-on-one with the poorest families in South Australia to keep kids out of the justice system and out of state-run institutions. And she had cut recidivism to as little as 3% in some of those years. So she believed she had the experience and the knowledge of the court systems and knew the right people around town to be offered the job. And she was right. So the state government acted or used a go-between to get Kate Cox on board. She was asked in December or ahead of her first day on the 1st of December 1915 if she wanted 6 women constables on her team. And she said, "No, just give me one woman. I don't even know what I'm going to do yet." And the woman that she chose was Annie Ross, who is below Kate there in this slide. Annie Ross, like Kate, had been working at the State Children's Council for many years. She had a similar upbringing, except her father was an alcoholic, but she had been working and volunteering and then working with the Salvation Army for many years before becoming an inspectress of lying in homes here in Adelaide. So Annie and Kate were both over the age of 29, which was at that stage the cutoff for officers in South Australia. But the rules were broken for both of them to allow them to start the women's police branch. So Kate Cox was given almost complete autonomy of the women's police branch, basically because the state government had no idea what she was going to do. Really, they just wanted her to police immorality and to prevent harm from women and against women and children, so that the reform groups and the powerful women's lobby in South Australia would keep off the state government's back. So Kate Cox decided the 2 big things that she decided that were to leave a lasting legacy here in South Australia were that She would have a separate women's police branch away from the main metropolitan station, and she would also not have uniforms, women's policing uniforms. Both of those things designed to sort of get around the stigma of being approached by women police and to ensure that women felt comfortable coming forward. So you can see here is Victoria Square in the centre of Adelaide. On the left-hand side of the image, you can see Landrowna Terrace and that row of terraces there. And they were at the Women's Police branch set up in 9 Landrowna Terrace, a one-room office with a wonky desk. And the male police officers gave Kate, because she was a staunch Methodist and a teetotaler, they gave her a huge whiskey bottle filled with ink as her ink bottle. The Metropolitan branch is just to the right of Landrowna Terrace there. You can see the Magistrates Court, which was then the police court, and the police station was there as well. So they weren't too far away, but they were distinct enough so that women felt that they could come forward. So in 1915, when they started, Adelaide, well, pretty luckily for us here in Adelaide, the built environment is sort of relatively similar. Obviously, we've got some skyscrapers getting built today, but lots of our heritage buildings are still there. But the world socially was a different place. So when the Women's Police Branch was set up, South Australia was inundated, or Adelaide was inundated by soldiers coming in from around South Australia and also interstate to be put on ships and sent overseas. So that was a huge issue for the fledgling Women's Police Branch. Also, you know, the women of Adelaide were just on every street corner doing everything they could to raise funds, basically, incredibly patriotic here in South Australia as across the nation for the war effort. We had, you know, it was a city of virtue and vice. We're known as the city of churches, but we had far more pubs than pews in Adelaide at this time, probably four times as many pubs in the CBD as there were churches. So Kate Cox, from the outset, it really was all about immorality. There's an opium den there. That is actually a picture from the State Library in Victoria. However, there were opium dens that Kate Cox was known to sort of march into and march young women out along Hindley Street here in Adelaide. So the women were given the same, exactly the same working hours as men. They worked 60-hour weeks. They had one day, Sunday off in 6. Kate Cox patrolled the city with a 5-foot cane. Her derisory nickname was 3 feet apart because that's what she would bark at any young couples caught canoodling on the city beaches or around Elder Park and in the parklands, which encircle Adelaide. So she was a very sort of curious paradox. She was incredibly aloof personally, but she was known in today's terminology, she had a very high EQ. So she was known to be empathetic, would sit down and talk to everybody. If she had young couples, she'd whack them with the 5-foot cane, but then she'd sit down and talk to them about why what they were doing was wrong. And basically everything she was doing was trying to stop young women from unplanned pregnancies. And given the context of the time, half of all first babies conceived in this era were conceived outside of wedlock. So if Kate and the girl's parents couldn't talk that young man into doing the right thing, then that young woman was, you know, obviously in absolute dire straits. So that's what she saw her role as that 5-foot cane being prevention. So yes, 60-hour weeks, one Sunday off in 6. She liked to think the women wore 1.5-inch heels working 60-hour weeks. They worked split shifts. So from early in the morning until sort of lunchtime, and then back again in the afternoon to work up to 11 p.m, midnight, even later sometimes, in which case the trams would have finished for the night, and Kate Cox was known many times a week to walk home to Parkside, south of the city centre. So she was Absolutely a household name in the first half of the 20th century. When she retired in 1935, so she'd been the head of the Women's Police Branch. That's her third from the left in the middle of those women. Brigadier General Lean, who was the police commissioner at the time, said that Kate Cox was the biggest woman he'd ever met, who never bungled anything, despite using some of the most unorthodox methods he had ever witnessed in his years in the police force. She was known to walk into the homes of abusive husbands and make the man get on his knees and recite the Lord's Prayer to repent. Despite being a strict Methodist, she was known to hold her hands to the nearest church for divine inspiration if she needed help with a case. As I said, the Women's Police Branch was initially set up to police immorality, prevent women and children from harm. In those early years, there's a big worry about white slave traders and opportunistic young men who would try and lure young women, particularly from country areas, with false adverts about job opportunities. And then they were taken into brothels and places of ill repute. Very quickly, though, Kate Cox and her team were tasked with working on all criminal cases involving women and children, and that was from the early 1920s, well before the likes of Scotland Yard. She was awarded 5 honourable mentions, which even today is rare, for her work on cases involving rape of a minor, abortion, which obviously was illegal at the time, a sodomy charge, a very controversial case involving an MP and publican here in South Australia. And she was also given an honourable mention for the poisoning murder of 2 infants in the country town of Port Lincoln here in South Australia. So they weren't just involved in prevention, although she did say that throughout her policing career, what her role was to prevent crime and to try and keep women out of the justice system is what she was really trying to do, just as she had done as a juvenile probation officer. In her 20 years as at the head of the Women's Police Branch, there was a 30% rise in the white women population here in South Australia, and women convicted of summary offences, drunkenness and the like, were actually dropped in South Australia despite that rise in the number of women. There were 14, she went from 2 women on the team to 14 women when she retired. The nearest in size was New South Wales, who then had 7 women. She was formidable and she left a lasting legacy in the police force. So South Australia was actually the last state in Australia to take women out of their own women's police branch and into just the normal police service. That didn't happen until the 1970s in South Australia, and they only adopted a uniform in 1974. Kate Cox, she was 60 when she retired, and a year later this is perhaps what she is best known for in South Australia, and it's undoubtedly the most complex part of her legacy. In 1935 and 36, she set up what became the Mothers and Babies Home in Brighton here in South Australia. It was for single women, first-timers who were pregnant. And she wanted to set up a home that gave women, in today's terminology, agency over the choice of having the baby adopted or not. So it was set up as a place where women, if they chose, could leave their baby for up to 3 years until they got themselves in a place in circumstances where they could take their babies home. So she was in charge for 15 years of the baby's home. And in that time, 37% of babies were adopted. Later on, after she died in 1954, the baby's home was named in her honour, the Kate Cox Memorial Babies Home. By the 1970s, up to 90% of babies at that home were being adopted out. So in 2011, when there was the federal inquiry into institutional forced adoption in Australia, the Uniting Church here in South Australia and Uniting Care Wesley were one of the first groups to issue an unreserved apology for mothers forced or coerced into giving up their babies for adoption from the Kate Cox Memorial Babies Home, and also to members of the Forgotten Australians and the Stolen Generations. So, as I said, that's a very complex part of her legacy, and for those invested in her name and her story. Thank you very much for allowing me to talk about Kate Cox, this pioneering policewoman here in South Australia. Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Lainey, thank you. Another fascinating woman, but a very different woman from the first two we heard about. Nevertheless, complex, as you say, with some complexities that would be very nice to tease out. While you were speaking, Lainey, it occurred to me, how influential was Kate Cox outside South Australia? Was she known? Was her work copied? What was her legacy elsewhere?
Yeah, so within 2 weeks of the Women's Police Branch opening here in South Australia, the police commissioner here was receiving letters from Ballarat, was the first place actually, receiving letters saying, what's this Women's Police Branch? What are they doing? How can it be used here? We've got women, knocking on our door as well. And so she was influential around Australia, and other Victorian government sent women police officers over to South Australia to work with Kate Cox. The New Zealand government had Kate Cox speak to their MPs when she travelled there in 1936. It was even after she died, there sort of this myth started circulating in the media here in Adelaide that she had influenced the development of the women police in the New York Police Department, which I couldn't find the smoking gun on that, but I found it absolutely fascinating that one of her brothers, she had two brothers, one of them was working in high levels for the Australian government in New York at the time that the women police were set up over there in New York, and also the Premier who hired Kate and initiated the Women's Police Branch in South Australia was actually working for the Australian government in New York and Washington at exactly the same time. So I think it's probably Frank was maybe knew the mayor, because it was the mayor's, obviously the mayor had the police department in New York, and it's quite possible that somehow, influenced it, but yeah, couldn't find the smoking gun, but a great story.
Great story indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you both, Jennifer and Lucy. If you could unmute, and you've already got your video screens on, so that's great. And the obvious thing that links these three women, I suppose, is a comment that several of you made, was that these were women who were lost to history. And that you have been, in a sense, rescuing the stories that have been lost. Can you expand a little bit, perhaps, on that? Any of you, Lainey, if you want to start, or
Sure. Yeah, when I started my PhD, I realised that, and it really sort of gave me the irrits, that women in general had been erased from this era. And it's right that we focus on the 60,000 young men who lost their lives overseas during the First World War. But I couldn't believe how little I knew about the women who weren't allowed to fight in the war, but spent every waking minute fighting for the war effort, and also running these voluntary organisations with military precision. Like the Red Cross in Australia raised like the equivalent of, well, not the equivalent of, but £14 million during the First World War. 14,000 care packages were going overseas every month to the Australian troops. They had, the League of Loyal Women had like little streetcars outside the trenches in overseas, so that men coming in and out of the trenches could get cigarettes, soup, tea and coffee and a bun when they, and a little bit of Australia. And I couldn't believe that I didn't know any of that. So that's why I ultimately decided to write fiction so that I could bring other women into the story as well as telling Kate Cox's story.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that links you and Lucy, of course, that both of you
Yeah.
have written fictional accounts. In terms of researching these women, all of you, and Jennifer too, what are the sources that we now have access to that we used not to have? Is it easier to find these women now than it was?
Well, all I can say is thank goodness for Trove.
Oh, absolutely.
And the ability, and there's so much archives you can, for instance, check Mary Fortune's stories, how they proliferated around the globe, via a website called the Westminster Detective Agency. There is all these digitized records which make life so much easier. But then you realize you're just skimming the stories and surface, and that there's so many really good stories out there which haven't yet been told.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Yeah, I just also want to say that so many of the archives, the state records, state archives, the not just digitizing, because I mean that's a massive project, but the indexing, the digitized indexes of state resources is just fantastic these days as well, which makes it so much easier to say go into State Children's Council records and search just one name, or the police commissioner's letters in and out of his office. I mean, and I think I can't speak for the other states, but the South Australian records were so far superior to when I went over to New York to try and go into the mayor's archives. Ours were just was night and day, the difference in our devotion to digitization and indexing.
Interesting. We have had a question, which first of all, thanks you all for interesting presentations, and then suggests the first two women seem to have been quite unreliable narrators, as Lucy so succinctly put it. How do you go about teasing out fact from fiction?
You look to see if there's some archival evidence which supports it. And quite often there is. The other is that she, as Mary Fortune, returns to certain motifs again and again. You have to take what she says with a pinch of salt, but as with the Taradale raid, she fudges the issue in her memoir, but then in an aside in the story, she actually says that she witnessed it. And then I sort of tried to get as much archival information in the Castlemaine court system as I could, but in the end I couldn't pin it down. But it is a strong supposition, and a lot of the time you are depending on strong suppositions, and quite often they turn out to be right down the track.
Yes. Jennifer, did you have a comment that you wanted to add?
I think in my particular case, you actually can't tell, and that's because this is a woman, I think, who is doubly buried. She's buried in the records because she is a working class woman. She is not herself particularly literate. She doesn't publish anything that we know of. There would be no way for her to be published, and so she's doubly buried, and we have to rely on the reports that are generated about her, and they're usually second or third hand. So what I was looking at is newspaper reports that are based on court reports by people who are watching court proceedings. Usually it's a very good way of getting an insight into people, as we know, who you otherwise wouldn't witness, but we don't know. But I think it's also interesting, the narrative in itself is interesting that she is constructing, so that is also worth analysis, I think. So if she is projecting herself as a respectable woman, what are the elements of that? How does she go about doing that? And how successful was she? I have my strong suspicions as to what Mrs. Conquest may have been up to in that particular evening in March, I have to say. And I'm quite surprised that her narrative was believed, but she must have been quite convincing, and perhaps her lawyer helped her. So I think in short, we can't with this particular woman. I think obviously with the other characters here, there's a lot more written about them, and they themselves write in a way that is very different. And so they're quite sort of different types of stories in that sense. Yeah.
Yes. But all very indicative of women's experience at the time, very different experience, of course.
Yes,
Yes, I have a feeling that maybe Kate Cox might not have been as credulous, but but perhaps that's wrong.
I
Yeah, but
don't
she also
the sort of
she
Mrs.
I
Conquest. Not
when
much.
I was researching her, I did find that like the archive will only tell you what the archive can tell you. So, and I think she really did control the narrative around her.
Mm.
Um, so there were three very short biographies written on her. Um, there have been. And the first one was based on a series of 10 interviews or a series of 10 articles based on a series of interviews in 1936 after she retired, and which sort of fed the others. And those series of articles almost read like parables. And I think it's what she wanted to be known about her. Like she kept that 10 years that's missing in the archive about her childhood, where when the family was separated, she kept that empty, and she also very much glossed over the fact that her father had been forced back into the mines, that her mother had been forced back into work as a teacher after, and that's luckily there were education department records which showed that Elizabeth had gone back to work, because I don't think Kate Cox wanted it known that her mum had gone back to work as a married woman.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
she tried to control the archive, and I think to Lucy's point, you've got to try and triangulate your
Mm.
there's so much that's missing, and there's so much that people only want you to know about them. So
Yes.
you've just got to try and triangulate your sources
Yes,
all the
indeed.
time.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Lainey, there is a question directly for you in the Q&A here. Was there a positive relationship between the women police and the male police?
Oh yeah.
You hinted at
Actually,
antagonism.
thank you so much, whoever's asked that, because I forgot to say that. So Kate Cox had a great relationship with men on the ground, and that was because probably she'd been making their lives easier for 9 years in the juvenile as a juvenile probation officer, where she worked one on one with families and believed no two children were alike, so everyone had to be treated differently. But particularly to start with, the upper echelons of the police force were absolutely dead against women police. They said that her work would be more suited to some women's philanthropic organisation, and that she would be absolutely useless. So the state government, to their credit, they put her in, and then very quickly started ramping up the numbers to support her. Whenever she asked for additional women, she basically got them. They weren't allowed to carry weapons or anything like that, but they, yeah, they were what she wanted. She generally got, because she very quickly became highly respected, and she was highly respected by the women of a certain social level in Adelaide, who had
Yes.
all the power, of course.
Why the ban on weapons particularly?
Oh, she asked I think it was 1920, if they could have tiny little handguns, and the police commissioner told her that it wouldn't be any more effective for a woman than a whistle. So yeah,
Thanks for that.
so no guns. They weren't trusted with guns.
The other thing that occurred to me while I was listening to all three presentations was that both of the first two women had children who were before the courts as potentially as criminal children or neglected children. And then Kate, of course, began her life as, what was she, a probation officer?
Yeah, juvenile probation officer.
Yes,
Yeah.
interesting. And I wanted to ask the question of any of you, really, how much interaction was there between the different court jurisdictions, and how much knowledge did they have of what each other was doing?
Well, if a child was judged to be neglected, they would be required, they would be assessing the child. A child would come up before the court, and so that they would ask the police for information about the family. And of course, the police it was their business to know everything about everybody. But and so Mary Fortune, when her son was sent to the neglected, was judged to neglect, she happened to be living in a home for unemployed governesses and domestic servants, which didn't admit males. So he was homeless, and she also had the previous year been locked up for drink. So that was the information, which meant that she. But police records was very important.
Yeah. And I'll just add to that by saying in those days, like the difference between today's reporting of court cases and just general misdemeanors and everything, the newspapers at the time were absolutely full of information. So not just the different court systems sort of knew about these main perpetrators in Adelaide. They would have come up before the court system a lot, women and men. So the courts all knew them. The courts all knew one another. I mean, in Adelaide, all the courts all know one another and all the lawyers all know one another and anything anyway. But in those days, everything was so heavily reported and so heavily policed. You know, there were patrolmen who would have known everybody and everything about everyone in the different suburbs and everything. So many more police on the actual beat working with these people. So I think I much more than today, I would say. That's the answer.
And in Victoria, Jennifer, was that the case, or?
I agree. The records are incredibly detailed in a way that we just don't see today. And also in Victoria, what I was looking at in particular was all of the suburban reporting. So each suburb often had its own newspaper with its own court reporter, and they spent a lot of time, as far as I could see, in the back chairs of the court watching what was going on and recording it in incredible detail. So it's a magnificent record in that sense. But I think, yes, avoiding publicity would be difficult. Certainly names crop up, as Lainey has said, in a way, across the courts, up and down between the various court jurisdictions. I'm quite sure the police had particular people under their target, so to speak, quite a lot. And so a much smaller world in that sense, literally as well as figuratively. In that sense, people just would have known a great deal, and the police would have been intimately acquainted, I think, with their particular areas and their particular subjects.
And did the different jurisdictions learn from each other? I mean, it's interesting thinking. Yes, I mean, were the court systems or the police in Victoria aware of what was happening, say, in South Australia or New South Wales, or?
Yes, they certainly kept in touch, and so that they'd record. So when George Fortune moved to Tasmania, the Tasmanian police were informed that this well-known jailbird had taken the ferry there, and it could extend to New Zealand. They monitored the movements of criminals between states.
Yeah, and again, the court cases were much better shared between the newspapers as well, because the newspapers were just following the big cases. So back when you sort of look at Trove and you look at the Adelaide newspapers of the time, there's so much more detail about interstate court cases as well, and not just the big sort of sensational ones.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. I think we might be just about out of time. So that was a really interesting discussion and just a fascinating reflection of three very different lives that still had some parallels with each other in ways that perhaps we might not have expected when we put these three papers together. So thank you, and thank you to those for those questions. A special thanks to our three wonderful speakers this evening, Lucy Sussex, Jennifer Anderson, and Lainey Anderson. And it was just a fascinating discussion. Thanks too to our colleagues behind the scenes, Katie Dunning of the Old Treasury Building, who managed the webinar so seamlessly, and Stephanie Holt and Molly McHugh of the History Council of Victoria. A special thanks to our sponsor, Monash University Publishing, which provides a wonderful gift to each of our speakers. And a brief plug for our next seminar, which will be held at the same time on Thursday, the 14th of May, on the topic, The Australian Legacies of British Slavery. So I hope you can join us again. So good night, everyone.